Thank you for joining the session. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Cobalt and Baltic, for inviting me on behalf of the Economist Intelligence Unit to present here, and most of all, of course, for providing the opportunity to engage in these very important conversations today. In the next 30 minutes or so, I hope to inform on how our cities in general, but specifically in the Baltics as well, can be better designed, managed, developed economically, and to become more enjoyable, desirable places for people to live in. And at the end of my presentation, we will continue the conversation with the Mayor of Vilnius, Mr. Šimašius, and take questions from the audience as well. So, I will structure the following presentation in two main parts. The first will focus on the current urban trends. So, in particular, looking at the concentration of activity in the capital cities. So just how much weight a capital city pulls in its respective country. And then looking into some of the demographic challenges that are causing the low urban growth, the shrinking urbanization that we've been talking about this morning. The second session will focus on something quite interesting in terms of the insights received from a particular study undertaken by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And it will discuss the finding and recommendations of that study, in particular looking into, again, the role of the public and private sector, how to make that relationship work, and also the importance of data to inform better policy. So in other words, I'll look at the importance of cities in the Baltics. When developing urban policies, what should be prioritized and how to go about doing that. So when we look at the share of the urban population as part of the national population, we see that the single largest city in each of the Baltic countries is contributing much more than, I would say, the general trends around the world. So it contributes much more to the overall population, and it's increasingly nearing 50% in the case of Estonia and Latvia. The exception here we see is Vilnius, actually, our host city, and the reason for that is the sheer size of the country. Lithuania is larger than the other two, but also the development of the cities inside the country in terms of the fact that it's not as monocentric as the other two. So we see Tallinn metro area and Riga metro area contributing nearly 43 or 50% of the population in the respective country, but Lithuania about a quarter or so for Vilnius. But the concentration of activity in cities is much more prominent when we look at the national income level contribution. It's even more striking, the importance of the capital cities. They pull way above their weight. So we see, for example, the Tallinn metro area, it will actually decrease in terms of its contribution to the overall national economic activity, but it will be around 50%, so way over the 47 or so in terms of its population. Riga metro area, even more so, it will reach, according to EIU projections, around 70%, so about 2/3 of the overall economic activity will be concentrated in that city. And again, in Lithuania, we see that it's much less than 50% for Vilnius, but it's way above the 23% in terms of its population share that we saw before. So it'll be interesting to take that conversation further in terms of what that means for the urban policy kind of on the national level, as well as on how that impacts the local development for Vilnius. So now that we've established the Baltic cities' significant contribution in terms of activity, both economic and kind of population activity, let's look at some of the other characteristics related to urban growth and development in the region. We've talked about kind of this trend, which is quite unusual to the rest of the world here in the Baltics, of actually shrinking urban growth. So while the rest of the world, we know that it's over 50% urban, and it's projected to reach over 60% by 2030. And a lot of that concentration of urbanization and fast, rapid urban growth is happening in sub-Saharan Africa. We see here on the right-hand side. But what is interesting is that, of course, the Baltics are the end of the spectrum, and they're delivering. They're the three countries out of the top 5 in the world with the lowest share in terms of the urban population in their country. And the cause for that is twofold. So, of course, we're aware of kind of the brain drain and the high cost of emigration that is happening here and the loss of the workforce. But also, on the other hand, there are lower birth rates as a result, and we see kind of an aging population that we'll discuss. Another kind of unfortunate, unenviable position to be at is the overall percentage of elderly people or population aged over 70%. Or over 70 of age. And we see again that the 3 Baltic countries are in the top 10 in the world in terms of aging population. So the nations in the Baltics here are rapidly aging, some of the slowest growing populations in the world. And of course that's creating some worries in terms of how to deal with such a high number of retirees. For example, in Latvia, one example is that the working population has fallen by a quarter since 2000. Again, that's a big kind of economic impact, as well as the share of GDP. Social spending in the Baltic countries is about half of that of many of the other Western European countries, for example. And of course, this will pose a major challenge for the national as well as the local government addressing, the decreasing workforce and the shrinking urban populations. The next one to look at, in terms of setting the context for the Baltics, is of course the high cost of emigration. So looking at the brain drain, we see in this chart, looking at the x-axis of the percent of population with tertiary education, and again, percent of immigrants with tertiary education, that Eastern Europe, so of course the Baltics is no exception, but a lot of the Eastern European countries are represented here as having some of the high percentage with immigrants with tertiary degrees. So 30%, for example, of those with university degrees between 2002 and 2009 had already immigrated, so a third had immigrated by 2014 across the Baltics. That's a big percentage. And some say that for the past decade or so, the loss to GDP has been between 0.6 and 0.9%, and by 2030, the GDP per capita in some of the Baltic countries may be lost by 3 to 4% than it would have been without this trend of emigration. So some say that this is kind of a lost decade, potential decade. And of course, there's an upside that some of the remittances, and also kind of the funding that from other sources, as we've discussed in terms of the European banks and other kind of private sources, they have helped for the infrastructure upgrades, but in terms of wages have grown actually faster than productivity, and while those may seem as kind of positive trends, they actually address the fact that the wages are growing in order to attract the workers, in order to attract kind of a more skilled labor force, and it's sending a kind of a bad signal, and it's making this actually less competitive in terms of the export, so it's having this negative impact overall and for investment and hurting economic growth. So on that a bit somber note, just wanted to sum up and kind of, as we've noticed, we've seen how cities can drive the country dynamics, so kind of the shrinking urban population and what that means. It's not due to the lack of rural to urban migration, but just the low birth rates and the overall high percentage of immigration. And the changing demographics, of course, mean changing cities, and that's putting a burden on how the public sector is addressing kind of the higher number of retirees as well. But the point I want to make and kind of segue into the next session is that urban people around the world actually have more in common with each other than, say, rural and urban people in the same country. So there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from other cities and other kind of experts in the field and other examples on what can be done to influence better policies and, in this sense, design better cities here in the Baltics as well. So the next section will draw upon some of the data that we've gathered through multiple surveys, and it really addresses kind of how to design better cities. But what I wanted to focus on a little bit, since the next session will focus on smart cities as well, is the importance of data. So of course, a lot of the analysis, the Economist Intelligence Unit, is underpinned by the data and the surveys that we do, the information that we gather. But there's a lot of data that is available out there at our fingertips in terms of the urban data. So the enablers are already there in terms of social media, geotagging, crowdsourcing. So kind of these different ways to create ratings and access preferences and opinions, this kind of instant feedback that can only influence policy for the better. But how can we make sure that this feedback actually feeds into the urban policies, and we use that technology as a catalyst for better design policies? Then of course the common standards for cities data, how can we quantify, how can we put a number on how well our cities are designed? And of course we'll attempt that through the different surveys that we undertake. And sharing, what can be done to share data among citizens to make smarter citizens, not just smarter cities, but also between cities, and kind of have this open data platform and exchange information and learn from each other. Finally, the policy needs to be proactive as much as reactive. And of course that can seem as a no-brainer, but a lot of the times we're kind of putting out fires and we're not really thinking about the long-term aspect and how we can utilize data. How can we, if you create a tech hub or ICT hub, what would that mean? What problem is it actually going to solve? So thinking about the long-term specifically. So as I mentioned, the rest of the presentation will focus in particular on that study that you see here, the Urban Infrastructure Insights from 2015. And the survey was, the respondents were over 400, 300 from kind of the private sector, and 400 policymakers in the urban field as well. And the purpose was really to investigate the state of the urban infrastructure and how can the private sector, as well as kind of the public, the city leaders, can engage with the citizens and to secure investment for long term. So the key findings, actually to start off, we're looking at the main obstacles to urban infrastructure and services, to either improving or creating new urban infrastructure and services. And you'll see here on this bar chart in green, we actually see the obstacles that are cited by one side, kind of the policymakers. And then in orange, we see the ones that are cited by the private sector, the business executive. And while there's overlap in some of the areas, which I won't read through all of them, but there is definitely a bit of a kind of discrepancies and a difference in opinion on what are the biggest obstacles. But as a whole, all respondents cited lack of political will at 40% as one of the main obstacles. The second was the lack of skills among officials, 39, and poor government effectiveness at 34. So you notice there are other ones, the lack of public funds, of course, financing, lack of effective procurement, corruption, so the need for better transparency on how public funds are being used, lack of appropriate regulatory framework. So a lot of the things that we have discussed in the previous sessions as well that come up over and over again. And of course, the next step is to discuss how to address these challenges, these obstacles. So this is a summary of kind of the main drivers and the main findings of how to address these. The first one is actually looking at that kind of lack of skills obstacle that we've discussed in the previous slide, but it's really, the point is here is to address a discord, actually. So while the business executive side cited that the lack of skills and kind of the need for more education is their top priority, the public sector executives, they actually didn't even put it in the top 3. So it's something that cannot be neglected and can be done more to invest in kind of this soft investment in human capital and social infrastructure, and in terms of the overall kind of improvement and capacity building for the public sector. The second, that we've heard a lot about PPPs, of course, today, and will continue to do so. It's no surprise that 82% agree that the government should work with a greater extent with the private sector. In time of shrinking budgets, that seems like a no-brainer as well in terms of where the financing will come from. But what the survey respondents wanted to make clear is that, of course, while the public sector should lead that, the private sector should really establish kind of a relationship, an ongoing relationship with the public sector, so that it's not just kind of a financing done deal. And also looking into other approaches in terms of innovative ways beyond PPPs as well, in terms of kind of land value capture or creating other finance mechanisms. Also another point, it's just a different variation of this kind of the standard direct way of doing PPPs. The third one, again, it's not a surprise that we've discussed a lot about transport, various types of kind of sustainable transport in our country, but also in our cities. And it was indeed the top top concern. The transport-related issues came up over and over again as the one to watch. And I'll go into more detail in the next slide, actually, on what that might be the case and whether that's really a silver bullet that will please both kind of the public as well as what kind of the policymakers can do to improve the conditions in cities. The next is when we talk about investment and attracting investment in particular. So over 75% of the city leaders assert that availability and quality of infrastructure will indeed affect investment from multinationals. So this is attracting investment possibly from abroad. And of course we see here kind of an alignment on the availability and the quality of infrastructure becoming really important. Not just for the quality of life, but also to make the city more competitive for investment. The next one is looking at policies before projects, and that's another one that high percentage, kind of a majority of the respondents insisted that the city officials and cities as a whole should prioritize maintenance and kind of improvement of the operations of the existing systems and services, rather than looking into creating new physical infrastructure. And again, that may be counterintuitive for some policymakers that are looking into creating kind of a legacy, a big, flashy legacy project, but it's not necessarily something that is a top priority for the citizens or even for the respondents in this survey, as they really look into just improving the infrastructure. And in the case in the Baltics, of course, when we look into kind of the the dynamics here in terms of demographics, as we mentioned before, the example that was given with China, growing at such a pace. Here we see that the challenges are slightly different, and it's more about maintaining that infrastructure and kind of improving it and making it more sustainable. The next one is looking into the power of data, which I mentioned before, how to make the most of it. And actually over 70% of the respondents said that they are willing to change their consumption patterns as well as their transport usage patterns if they're given better access to information about their use of services. And that's, on the one hand, just people having access to kind of their patterns of movement or consumption and how that will influence them to take a step back and maybe rethink it, make it more sustainable. But there's also another point here on kind of feeding that information for policymakers as well as the private sector to get involved and be able to create kind of more sustainable policies and to inform better policies with all of that data that is available. A large percentage also supported the creation of a platform for continuous feedback from citizens on all of that information that is gathered. And then this leads me to the next point, which is about citizen engagement, collaboration, and buy-in. And of course, that's something that, again, was discussed and was brought out in different forums here. The need for kind of involving the public from the beginning, but also not just from the planning and design stages of a particular project, but also through the implementation. And this increases the ability of people to feeling kind of the ownership that is created between people of a particular project, and it's minimizing the pushback that they potentially could feel if the project doesn't quite live up to the expectations, basically minimizing the risk of not living up to their expectations as well, and creating this kind of collaboration and buy-in from all stakeholders. And lastly, learning from peers and collaborating early and often. And this is really looking into looking beyond your team and working with other teams and in collaboration, not in silos, but also kind of looking at different lessons from different different cities as well, and kind of sharing this platform, or in a forum like this that we are here at today. So, as I mentioned, I'd like to zoom in into transport. It's no surprise that we've discussed quite a lot on the transport side here today as well. It may seem like kind of this magic, silver bullet, kind of panacea that will solve everyone's problem, will make everyone happy. So in the bar chart here is actually making an interesting point. So in the top one, we see that there's quite an alignment, if not kind of pretty much the same priorities in the immediate future as well as in the short term. So the question is, which areas of the country's urban infrastructure and services require most attention in the immediate future? So what needs an improvement or maintenance? What needs to be fixed now? But also which areas will potentially need an improvement in the next 5 years? And you might think that people are kind of short-sighted and they might just focus on the immediate problem, and that's probably the case. But I think this is an interesting point for policymakers as well, if they're thinking of the legacy that they want to leave. That improving the transport side, so we see here in the top 3 is transport-related issues, so transport in terms of roads, in terms of metros and railways, in terms of airports, just kind of creating that ease of access and mobility and sustainable public transport in the city. Those are the issues that will keep coming up in the next 5 years or so. So if a project is created and it lives through like the political cycle, it will be something that is recognized down the line as well. So it's an interesting kind of opportunities. And I think in terms of the other areas that are addressed here, so not just focusing on transport, you'll notice that it's about energy and kind of waste disposal and possibly solid waste as well. And I think possibly why people are so kind of concentrated and enamored with transport is a bit of a cognitive dissonance as well. So looking into kind of, transport is quite visible. So everyone commutes. It's much easier to notice congestion and traffic and pollution or potholes on the streets. So it's something that is very visible and very close to everyone's mind. But it's much easier to kind of disregard all of the other infrastructure that is really the backbone of the city in terms of the energy grid or kind of the solid waste and the sewage in the cities as well. So again, this could be a bit of a kind of mind trick that we play on each other, but it's potentially good in terms of aligning again what the public sees as important, at least in terms of their immediate perceptions, and what the public and private sector can address together as well. So before I close, I actually wanted to include this, and again, it's looking around transport, but from the perspective of what makes a city kind of more attractive for investment, or the ease of doing business, kind of the overall business environment, as well as what makes it a more livable city, increases the quality of life. And it's a survey actually that dates back a few years to 2010 called Liveonomics, and it looks, again, it's a similar type of survey that the respondents were about 600 urban professionals, so urban experts in the field. And again, when asked what would improve their city, what would change the city for the better, make it less stressful, improve the quality of life, the top answer was around public transport and the road lengths and parking. And when they were asked about the main priorities for the city leadership in terms of making the city more competitive, again, transport came up over and over again as the top priority. So there's something to be said about aligning, what makes a city competitive and what makes it livable as well. And while, of course, livability is worth pursuing on its own merit in terms of improving the quality of life of the citizens, it shouldn't be underestimated the power that improving the quality of life or the quality of the infrastructure has in terms of competitiveness, making the city more competitive and making it more attractive and creating more jobs and making it economically competitive as well. So there's something to be said about an alignment here. So to summarize, and again, this is not just to create a recipe for success necessarily without being too prescriptive. I just wanted to say what were, again, the main themes that came out from the research that was undertaken and all of the data. Of course, the first one was strong and accountable leadership, and this was to address kind of the lack of skills and lack of kind of possibly initiative or capacity that the city leadership might have. Continuous citizen engagement, and this is, of course, something that we discussed in terms of, through all stages of the process, in terms of, creating that platform and engaging in various ways, and specifically, creating the transparency that, the use of public funds so that to create trust in the public as well in terms of what the next steps are. And then, of course, sustainable relationship with the private sector, as I mentioned, in various formats. So PPPs is one, but there are also other innovative ways, such as land value capture or just the uplift of the economic activity in a particular area as well. And the other one was looking into the measurement and evaluation of impact with data, and we discussed that a little bit, and we will continue to do that in the next session. The final is learning from peers and how to share that information and know-how among each other. So these were identified as important in terms of the issues that came up over and over again and the possible solutions, and those can potentially be applicable to the Baltics. These are, of course, no quick fixes. They take time, and they're not a shortcut. And cities often must rely on a combination of the solutions that are offered here to improve the skeleton of their city, which is their infrastructure. So I'm happy to take questions after. I just wanted to actually end with a quote by Italo Calvino and one of my favorite books called Invisible Cities. And to paraphrase the quote, it goes, cities are not about the physical infrastructure, rather the physical capital, the infrastructure and the buildings, but it's really about the citizens and their relationship with the physical infrastructure. So